Howdy, with this video, I want to go over essay number one. Make sure you understand what I'm looking for with the assignment so you can get started on it. I'm doing this video on Monday, September 13th, and you'll find the information for essay number one on the content page, and I already got it pulled up under material for essay number one. And under this, you'll see the assignment itself. You'll see the topic choices for the assignment, a fiction terms list, which I'll go over in a separate not email, but a separate video. And you'll see a sample student essay, which we'll go over here in a second. And then you'll see three of the selections from the topic choices. Most of them are coming out of your textbook, because I think it's easy for you to just use your textbook. But there's a couple of choices there outside our textbook if you want to give those a shot. I already got essay number one open in Word here, so I'm going to go ahead and open that. For this essay, you're going to write a 1,000-word minimum 6-paragraph literary research essay using MLA documentation on one of the topics on the topic sheet, which we'll look at here in a second. Your essay should utilize at least 2 sources other than your textbook, and no dictionaries, encyclopedias, class lectures. For all you know, I made all that stuff up just for funsies. I promise I didn't. I'd get fired if I did. But I want you to look at other sources for these movement definitions, so you can kind of see where I got them from for the most part, or to see if they kind of match what I've been saying. I'm going to be providing those throughout the week. It'll probably take me a good week to get them all up there, but hopefully when you come in on the 22nd, those will be up there. No, not hopefully. They will be up there on the 22nd, so you can start on this essay, particularly the research side of it. But within your essay, you're going to define and discuss one of the movements we've been talking about, and then relate that movement to the short story in question in 3 ways. So if you wanted to use something like Stephen Crane's The Open Boat, you could relate The Open Boat to realism in 3 ways. I'll show you the trick here once we get into that sample essay. It's not as easy as the first sounds. You also are free to decide a work does not reflect a particular movement or tradition. Some of these authors are like us. We're kind of in the middle of all these ideas, and we may reject some, we may kind of accept some, or have to work with some, maybe not always due to choice. So you can kind of mix it up a little bit. Generally, I've tried to pick short stories that kind of match a particular movement, but if you want to look at it from the other way, that's perfectly fine. But you're not going to summarize a short story in the essay, and you'll see that here pretty quickly. Your essay should involve analysis showing us why this particular short story represents that particular movement. We'll look at the topics here in a second, but for the general organization of the essay, the first paragraph of the essay should define the literary movements using at least 2 good sources. It may take 2, maybe 3. Some of these movements are pretty complex, and some like existentialism always start off with existentialism. It's hard to define, which isn't helpful when you have you're a student having to write an essay. But if you get a couple of good sources, 2 or 3 good sources, you should be able to put together a good definition for your first paragraph. And that's all you're going to do in this paragraph, is just define that particular movement. I don't want to hear about the author. I don't want any biography of the author or anything, nothing like that. Just you defining the movement using these sources. The second paragraph is going to briefly introduce a short story, and that means like maybe 1 or 2 sentences. You're assuming your reader's already read the story, so you don't have to give an entire plot summary, right? They just got to briefly introduce the story, maybe who wrote it, when it was written, and then provide your thesis statement that's going to relate the short story to the movement in 3 ways. The trick is those 3 points that you're going to use in your essay need to come from that first paragraph. You just can't give me kind of lame definitions in the first paragraph and then just kind of make up 3 points from my lecture notes or something, or just out of thin air. They should come directly from your first paragraph, and we'll see that in action here in a second. That second paragraph should be pretty short. If you're going over 100 words, it's probably getting a little too long. The third, fourth, and fifth paragraphs are each going to discuss one of the ways the story relates to the movement. That should come directly from your thesis statement. If you're having a sense of deja vu, we're kind of going back to that 5-part essay a little bit. We're just adding a definition paragraph at the beginning of it for the movement. So it's kind of a formulaic essay the first time around. We'll get away from this again with subsequent essays. But within the body paragraphs, there should be no research within those body paragraphs. If you're thinking about it, ask me first. It's a good way just to lower a whole letter grade. I don't want to hear what other people say about the story. I want to see what you're seeing in the story and why you think it relates to the movement in a particular way. So again, you got that 3-point thesis with the 3 points coming from the first paragraph, and then these body paragraphs are coming directly from those 3 points in your second paragraph. 6 paragraphs should be your concluding paragraph. What are we supposed to take away from your analysis? And that's going to depend on your movement and things like that. We'll talk about that when we actually get into looking at the drafts and stuff. You should quote at least 3 times from the short story in question. Employ all the fun punctuation we learned in Comp 1. You're going to use at least 5 of the fiction terms on the literary fiction terms list. I'm going to go over those in a separate video. You don't have to define those terms in your essay. I just want you to use them properly. Get used to using literary terms when you write about literature. And as always, no I, you, your, get, got, or it. Hopefully you're working to get those words out. It's okay, like in a response paper, once in a while to throw an it in there, just because you're writing quickly and you just want to get it done. But with this essay, we're going to go back to that more formal style where we're eliminating some of these words. All right, so I'm going to pull up the topic list. That was the second link up there on D2L. It's a little small. You've got, I believe, 10 choices here. And I've kind of picked 1 or 2 works from each movement because if you like the Enlightenment, we're kind of fascinated by it. Abraham Williams is a very interesting person to look at. His election sermon as a sermon that's coming before the Declaration and all that. He's trying to work with these Enlightenment ideas, but trying not to throw out the baby Jesus with the bathwater. So he's got this interesting combination of religion, of kind of this Puritan-based religion that he's trying to, and also trying to apply some Enlightenment principles into some of that religion and how we live our lives. It's a very fascinating sermon. So that might be one of your choices. Notice over here it tells you where the short story. This is actually a sermon, not a short story, but it's kind of handled the same way. Where it's at there. We got a couple of romantics. If you want to use the birthmark, it's kind of one of our longer readings. So, if you spent the time to read it, you can use it for the essay. If you hated the birthmark, you may just not want to use it. If you like Edgar Allan Poe, the Catskill Amontillado is a good work to kind of compare to American Romanticism, particularly the Gothic side of it. There's certainly Gothic elements in the birthmark there, weren't there? With the lab and Aminadab and fires and all that good stuff. The Romantics like setting these huge, big scenes, and that creates all this interesting symbolism, and it's just a fascinating way to write. Kind of take note of any, I guess they're trigger warnings. The Catskill Amontillado is about a crime. It's got dark themes. The violence can be kind of disturbing. It kind of depends on the reader. So be careful there. You can use the open boat and relate it to American realism. If you want to, you can also pick Susan Glaspell's A Jury of Her Peers. A very interesting question about morality and what's really true and what's not true and how we interpret all that in many different ways. Very interesting short story to work to relate to American realism. If you like American modernism and the complexity and the fragmentation, Faulkner's good for that. He does deal with race a lot, and race in the Deep South, and generally prior to World War II. So there's some racial language in there. If you're not comfortable with that, don't pick the short story. You don't have to read all these short stories. Most of these, if you read the first 2 paragraphs, you're going to kind of go like yes or no, right? Another one, Zora Neale Hurston's The Gilded Six Bits, Harlem Renaissance writer, fascinating African-American female writer that was kind of embodying some of these ideas of the Harlem Renaissance, but also kind of poking at the guys who were in charge of it. She loved to use dialect and show Southern African Americans the way she saw them in real life. She was an anthropologist by training, and she's like, there's nothing wrong with our culture. A lot of the Harlem Renaissance males were like, we need to elevate our culture and present ourselves as something high, way up there. And she's like, well, that's not the people I know. I know fairly normal people, and I want to write about them, and that they're worth writing about. And you're definitely going to get that in The Gilded Six Bits. Also, there's elements of American modernism in there somewhere, because she was responding to some of those ideas as well. But when you get a choice between 2 movements, you need to pick one of these. Don't try and do the Harlem Renaissance and American modernism. Pick either one or the other. Fascinating writer, Flannery O'Connor, Good Country Peoples, kind kind of one of her least violent short stories. She's a Christian writer, but when you read her short stories, you're kind of like, wow, okay. She's into this. She discusses these existentialist ideas, generally arguing against them in some ways, maybe not so much in other ways. It's kind of for you to decide. She also likes the use of grotesque. That's taking things to extremes, kind of wondering what's really normal in our modern world, and is it normal what's really grotesque. Fascinating writer, and you might want to look at her. Another long one we worked with is Sonny's Blues. So, again, if you spent the time reading it, you have the option of using it in the essay. And you can relate that short story to existentialism or postmodernism. Again, don't try and do both. Sherman Alexie's a Native American writer, a really, really good writer. Also a really good poet. He kept winning the National Poetry Slam over and over, and finally he just kind of retired so he could let somebody else win. An excellent poet, really good short story writer. Writing about Native American themes, but also discussing kind of the Native American experience in the modern world. So if your culture's been appropriated or just destroyed, what's it being replaced with, and what kind of effect does that have on a Native American in modern America? Very interesting short story there. And Jennifer Egan's Black Box, you were supposed to read the first 6 sections of that. If you want to go ahead and read all the sections and use that for your essay, that'd be a good choice. It's kind of what you're into. Kind of maybe pick the movement you're interested in, or one that you found interesting. You may disagree with it, but it's kind of interesting to research it and see what's going on there. And pick a short story that you want to work with. And that's kind of your job for this coming weekend, is to find the short story you want to work with and the movement you want to work with, and come in on the 22nd and be ready to start going on that first paragraph and first, second, and third paragraphs. All right. But those are your choices. You're going to pick one of those. And again, if you have more than one movement as a choice, you're going to pick one of those movements. Don't try and do both. All right. So we're going to go back to the content page in D2L. And we're going to look at the sample student essay. I'm going to go ahead and download that and open it up. There it goes. All righty. And if you go back to that assignment sheet, if you remember, the first paragraph should define the movement, and that's about it, using 2 or 3, or you can use more if you want to, but 2 or 3 good sources to define, in this case, the Enlightenment. And he's going to eventually show how Thomas Paine's common sense represents the Enlightened movement in 3 ways. But to begin with, and that's not one of your choices. That's why I kind of use this as a sample essay. Also, common sense is italicized because it's a pamphlet. It was published independently. Your short stories will be in quotation marks without italics. But the first paragraph, just going to define the Enlightenment. And here we go. The 18th century was the century of Enlightenment. The Enlightenment was a movement in science, politics, religion, and literature that questioned virtually all accepted truth. I kind of gave a couple of broad statements. Now he needs to get into some detail. Historian Bruce Lancaster explains that a combination of increased wealth and insatiable curiosity resulted in a ferment of questioning during the Enlightenment. Notice he's supporting what he just said there with a source, right? And that's what quotes should do. They support what you're saying. Beverly McClure summarizes the period by stating the Enlightenment, also known as the Age of Reason, is the name given to the period. But you kind of notice he's starting to get some talking points here. Into a new age enlightened by reason, science, and respect for humanity. And then he's got to continue with that definition, right? Literature of the time period, which was almost entirely nonfiction, provoked thought and rationality in place of emotion. So trying to piece together these different sources to get a good definition going, and kind of, as he's doing with the Enlightenment, showing that it's all about reason and science, rationality. The Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy, it's not really an encyclopedia in the classic sense. They have very good articles on most of these movements, and I'll be posting those as the week goes by. Condenses the Enlightenment movement into a few central concepts. These include liberalism, republicanism, toleration, and scientific progress, as well as the universal truth that humans are fundamentally equal creations. All right, if you kind of remember back to the Declaration, you kind of hearing all these words come back. Although these ideas began in Europe, they quickly spread to the American colonies, where a fresh appreciation of logic and reason ultimately led to the birth of the United States. This was, by the way, this was his draft. This wasn't his final version. A pretty good definition of the movement there. You want to be careful, if it just says as the movement in the 1700s, that doesn't really give you any discussion about the literary side of the movement, which can be a little bit more difficult with the Enlightenment because they weren't writing fiction. But he does a good job of defining the Enlightenment and what the literature looks like and what to expect if we read something from that. Of Enlightenment authors, Thomas Paine, author of Common Sense, is remembered as one of the most influential, and that's absolutely true. His pamphlet was so popular that John Adams expected common sense to become the common faith of the people during the American Revolution. Kind of don't want much research outside the first paragraph, but he asked about it, and I said, yeah, sure, it's just one sentence. He's not padding his paper with extra research or anything. And that's a really good book on John Adams, that McCullough book. But America was in need of a message that would galvanize. I'm going to quit reading this here in a second. But notice he gets down, he introduces the work real quickly, and then he gets down to his thesis statement, and I would expect to see the 3 ways common sense represents the Enlightenment in this thesis, and that's exactly what he delivers. Common sense includes elements of almost every central idea of the Enlightenment, including those of logic and reason, toleration, and liberalism. And those came straight from that first paragraph using the exact same wording, and that's exactly what we're looking for. That kind of precision where the thesis in the second paragraph comes directly from the definition in the first paragraph. And then as we talked about, the body paragraph should follow the thesis, so we should get a paragraph on logic and reason. And there we start going there, talking about the structure being logical and the order and logical reasoning being emphasized within the work. And then he's going to give an example. And you can kind of see how that's going to work. You want to kind of talk about the work, what you're seeing in the work, and then use a quote to support it and show why that work represents the movement in that particular way. I kind of noted there that the long quotes only needed to be tabbed over once. Thomas Paine's Common Sense also includes elements of another prominent theme of the Enlightenment, toleration. And that's exactly coming back to that thesis statement. That's exactly the second point. That's what the second body paragraph is going to talk about. And you can read that. You can read faster than I can talk. But notice that he's given his ideas, supporting him with quotes. Threw in a little research there, but again, he asked me about it. I really don't want you to do that unless you absolutely feel you have to. And it should be something like this, one little sentence to clarify something you're talking about. And then he's talking about toleration and how that runs through common sense. That paragraph's kind of relying on that long quote, maybe a little too much. Could use a little bit more development. But he's got the basic outline of the essay going, right? Then he talks about liberalism. That's kind of a differently defined term these days. So he has to make sure he defines any terms that are particularly ones that might bring about some ambiguity in the essay. So he kind of gives his definition there. Liberalism was a belief in limited self-government. It might mean something different today, but that's what he was talking about with the Enlightenment and common sense. And then he develops this paragraph around that idea, using short quotes instead of long quotes. Be careful about too many long quotes. You don't want to look like you're padding your paper with long quotes and getting to the word count through long quotes. They don't count as part of your word count anyway. But doing a good job, giving quotes, talking about the quotes. And then we get to our conclusion. And kind of the point of the conclusion is, what are we supposed to take away from your analysis? You've built up this argument that this work represents this movement in 3 ways, or maybe you argued that it didn't. But what am I supposed to take away from that? Does this going to change the way I live, the way I look at literature? Does it say something about humanity in general? Kind of make sure you're kind of taking us out to the big picture, kind of like we've talked about with all the essays in Comp 1. Don't just repeat what you've said in your essay. Make sure you're kind of bringing us out to the big picture and placing your ideas within the context of the broader scope of things. And of course, he has his works cited space there. Source is going to be a little dated because this essay is a little bit dated, but pretty good essay overall. It's doing a good job of meeting the assignment guidelines and following the paragraph outline from the assignment sheet. But so you can kind of see it's kind of a formulaic essay, but it's kind of a good formula for general basic literary essays, and that's what we're going to work with this time. If you have any questions, be sure to let me know. And again, your job this weekend is to find the short story you want to work with, choose the movement you want to work with, and be coming on the 22nd, ready to look at the sources I post and start going on this essay. And hopefully by the end of class on the 22nd, within those 3 hours, you'll have your first 3 paragraphs of the essay. You can kind of see once you have the first 2 paragraphs, you're kind of ready to write the essay, or hopefully you will be. It's not an easy essay. It sounds easy at first, but it's a little more difficult than it first sounds. But you'll get through it. But I'll hush up here, and we'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.